Okay, so we will now focus on moral and non-moral statements. Let's begin with just a short review of a key concept that we learned about earlier in the semester. As you will recall, a very important concept that was associated with argument is as follows. Note that I'll be using the triangle in this lecture to denote a fundamental and powerful concept. That's my symbol. When I use this method for teaching a concept, I always put the word that names the concept in the bottom left-hand corner. The concept we are going to be focused on is named by the word statement. Okay? So in the bottom left corner of the triangle, I put the word that names the concept. In the top corner, or to the right of the top corner, I will put the definition, the meaning of how that word is being used with respect to the concept, that is the properties, characteristics, or features that something must have to count as a correct example of how we're thinking about a concept and hence how we're using a word. Recall that the way that we have defined statement is a declarative sentence. And by the way, you'll want to write very small because within 2 or 3 videos, we're going to add a bunch of information that you will need to do well on various items in the task in which this is embedded. So a declarative sentence asserting something about reality, making a claim that something is at least in theory true or false. So I'm paraphrasing what I said in an argument module, but all the basic ideas are there. So a declarative sentence asserting something about reality, making a claim that something is at least true or false, that is with respect to that assertion about reality. So it makes an assertion about, a statement makes an assertion about reality that can in theory at least be categorized as true or false. So when I use this method, this visual method, what I usually do is I put examples in the bottom right-hand corner, okay? Now, I'm not going to do that because the point of this lecture is not to focus on the notion of a statement itself. Rather, we are going to learn some new terminology relevant to understanding from a philosophical standpoint, from an ethicist standpoint, our notions about right and wrong, and hence making sense of everyday life, such as the pandemic and the various moral issues that have arose because of that. So you're going to want to have about 1 inch up here, about 2 inches here, about 1 inch down here. You're going to want about 2 inches here and about 3 inches here, but we're going to leave this space here. So I'm just letting you know how to lay out your notes. So let's go ahead and introduce our new concepts. So one very important concept that I want you to become aware of is going to be that of, and try to place your information where I place it so that you can fit everything in. Like I said, write very small. What I find is that if students don't really pay attention to what I'm saying in terms of my coaching for the notes, their diagram will not be correct and then they get incorrect answers. So how you place the information, where you format the information is crucial. Where I am placing information, where I'm formatting it, the arrows I draw, it's all important to understanding the concepts and how they connect to one another. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to draw a triangle that's about 1.25 inches high, I guess you could say. And the concept that we are going to be focusing on here, and I actually meant to put this in blue, The word that names the concept that I want to focus on now is named by the words moral statement. And then the other concept that we are going to be focusing on during this lecture, we'll put right over here. Okay, and the words that name the concept that I want to focus on over here will be non-moral statement. So notice that I have these triangles here on the same row. Okay, so I'm going to call this, for easy reference, I might refer to rows. This will be row 1, where I have the concept triangle for statement, and then this will be row 2. Okay, so row 1 is for the first concept triangle, row 2 is for the next 2 concept triangles. All right, so that said, let's go ahead and draw some arrows. So, like I said, here I normally would put examples, but we've already had the lesson on statements and lots of examples, so I'm not going to be doing that. Rather, I'm just going to draw a little arrow that goes to about right there. Don't draw the arrow too far because we're going to write a definition here, and then this one you can do quite far. Okay, this just says that here's our definition for statements, and we're going to go into 2 kinds of statement, 2 examples of a statement. So during the argument module, we talked about statements, and then we gave examples of statements. We also gave examples of statements in terms of premise and conclusion. So we could have done a concept triangle for premise and one for conclusion, but here I don't want to talk about statements in terms of premises and conclusions. I want to talk about them in terms of statements being moral statements or non-moral statements. You can have this. You can have a non-moral statement as a premise or a conclusion. You could also have a moral statement as a premise or a conclusion, by the way. All right, so let's get into some definitions. So a moral statement, so write very tiny up here, the definition that we'll be using in this class for moral statement, affirms that an action is good or bad, or, sorry, not an action is good or bad, that's wrong. That an action is right, or what I meant to say is wrong, or that a person is good or bad. Okay, so action is right or wrong, or that a person is good or bad. Okay, so some examples of a moral statement, I'm going to give you some very easy or simple ones to scaffold your learning, include the following. Capital punishment is wrong. Okay. Jean should not have lied. You ought to treat others the way you want to be treated. Jose is a good person. Cruelty to animals is wrong. Okay, so one thing I want to call your attention to is how we know beyond, or how we can decide whether a statement is affirming that an action is right or wrong or good or bad. And one way is to look for words that indicate that a moral value is being assigned to an action or a person. So here, the action is capital punishment, and we see that the word naming the fundamental and powerful moral concept is wrong. Gene, here it's harder to see should, but in philosophy and in ethics, when we make a claim like this about something significant like lying, you see the word should and you have should not, that is considered also assigning moral value. In other words, this means it was wrong for her to do that. So here, should not means wrong. Now, should and should not don't, well, I'll get more into that in a moment. So you ought to, right? So here, should not, in other words, saying it was wrong for someone to have lied. Ought to also is kind of like should not. Typically indicates, though not always, that a moral value is being assigned to something. And here it's a wide category of actions or a general rule to use for behavior or guide when interacting with others or when considering, when interacting with others. So ought to means it's the morally correct thing to do, it's the right thing to do. Jose is a good person. Here, a moral claim is being made specifically about a person, that he's good. And then here we've got cruelty to animals is wrong. So the action that is the focus of this statement is cruelty to animals, and the value that's being assigned to it is wrong. So you should be able to figure out, okay, here are the things you should be able to do as a result of this. For each of these, is an action or a person is the statement focused on an action or a person? And secondly, are they saying that the action is right or wrong? Or are they saying that a person is good or bad? Okay, so on that note, we're going to go over to non-moral statement. So a non-moral statement affirms a state, right, really small here, of affairs is actual, but makes no claims about rightness or wrongness or goodness, or I don't know if you'd say badness. I'm just going to say evil here because badness sounds kind of weird. Okay, so here I'm giving you the definition for how we'll be using non-moral statement. So there's really two parts to a non-moral statement that I want you to understand. It affirms that a state of affairs is actual, and that is actually what a moral statement is doing. It's affirming that a state of affairs is actual with respect to the morality of a given action or a person. But here, an important part is that what does it say? Makes no claims about the rightness or wrongness or goodness or evil. Okay, so some examples that I want you to copy here and think about how they correspond with what is over here. Okay, so capital punishment is wrong. Let's say we write many people think, I'm going to use CP for short, capital punishment is wrong. Okay, so here's an opportunity to practice intellectual carefulness. This is about what? What people think. And people think that something is wrong, what? Capital punishment. But doesn't actually say that capital punishment is wrong, right? So that's not the point of the statement. You can't just focus on this part. Remember, I'm always telling you guys that context matters. You have to look at the whole statement. That right there is a moral statement. Capital punishment is wrong. That we have the value of wrongness being applied to a wide category, to an action that is capital punishment. But that's not the whole of the statement. This statement is about what people think. And the statement's not saying whether it's right or wrong for people to think that, or that it's only good or bad people think that. It's just saying this is what people think. Okay, so then we have Here we have Jean should not have lied. Compare that to Jean lied. Again, lying might be bad or wrong, but nowhere in the statement does it say that. Okay? There's nothing explicit here about wrongness, goodness, or badness. There's no word indicating that a moral value is being assigned. It's just saying that this happened in reality. Maybe we could go and check it and verify it. Okay, so you ought to treat others as the way he treated you. We could say you treated Mike as he treated you. So you treated Mike as he treated you. Compare that to what we have over here, right? So we have you ought to treat others the way you want to be treated. So in other words, that's the right thing to do. It would be wrong if you didn't do it. Here, it doesn't say anything about rightness, wrongness, goodness, or badness. It's just making an empirical claim about something that happened in reality. Okay, and then finally, or two more examples. Jose is a good person. Compare that to Tanya tries to be a good person. Okay, so again, here we see that goodness is definitely being assigned to who? Jose, a person. But here, this is not saying that Tanya is good. It's making a claim about something that Tanya strives to be. She strives to be someone who could be called a good person, but this does not say that Tanya is a good person. The focus of the statement is that she's trying to be something, and of course in this context, a good person. So one more example of how we're using non-moral statement. Animals are treated cruelly. Okay, so compare that with cruelty to animals is wrong. Animals are treated cruelly. Okay, so again, this assigns wrongness to what? The action of being cruel to animal, how you approach animals. This one doesn't say that anything is right or wrong. In your mind, you might think that cruelty is wrong, but this is just saying that this is just describing how animals are treated, but it doesn't say it's right or wrong. It just says this is how they are treated, but it doesn't assign a moral value to that approach to animals. Okay, so we need to do a little list down here, and what you're going to want to write is kind of like that 1-inch space that I told you needed. You're going to want to write typical words indicating assignment of a moral value. Which, by the way, I forgot to add that as a note. Here, a moral, okay, let's write that. A moral value is assigned to something. Okay, but here, no moral value is assigned to anything. All right, so then let's talk about, let's list out some words. So we already have some words that we can try to spot when thinking about whether a statement is a moral statement or a non-moral statement. So obviously we have right. All right. So the opposite of right would be what? Let me pan back out. So we have right, and then over here we could have the word wrong. Over here we can have good. Over here we can have bad. Over here we can have should. In other words, it would be wrong if you didn't do something, or it's the right thing to do. We would also have ought. In other words, it would be wrong if you didn't do it. In other words, it's the morally correct thing to do. So here we would have should not, ought not. So in philosophy and ethics, most of the time, or a lot of the time when you see should not or ought not, should or ought, you need to understand those as moral terms. Ought is assigned with the idea of moral obligation. It's something you are required to do. It's wrong if you don't do it. And then should also with moral obligation. It's something you must do. It would be wrong if you didn't. It's morally required of you. Some other phrases that you might, but not always. Sometimes these words are just used in presidential sense. So like if I just said, you should brush your teeth, I'm not making a moral claim. I'm just being prudential and saying it would be wise for you to do so. Okay, so some other phrases that you might see is moral. What do you think the opposite is there? Immoral. Another phrase you might see is morally permissible. So here you might see morally impermissible. You could also have morally incorrect. So just like you could have morally incorrect over here, you could have morally permissible, but you could also have morally correct. Another word that you could have over here is the morally can be understood. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Morally obligated, sometimes you'll just see obligated. Okay. So those are some words that you can use and keep in mind when you're looking for and trying to decide whether a moral value is being assigned to something. That said, keep in mind this important iteration. Just because a statement has any or some version of these words in it, that doesn't mean that the statement is necessarily a moral statement. In other words, having one of these words in a statement is not a sufficient condition for deciding whether a statement is a moral one or a non-moral one. I went over this possibility with respect to these examples. So this is a good example of that. This has the word wrong, but it's not a moral statement, and I already went over why. And then this has the word good in it, and yet it's not a moral statement, and I already went over why. So you still have to think critically when you're looking at the statements and trying to decide whether they're a moral statement or a non-moral statement.